Welcome back, everybody. This is week 2 of our self-portrait. So I'm painting over my first pass from last week, which I went over with a big house painting brush to soften all of the edges and let the painting dry. And now I'm going back over it again and just re-establishing the drawing. So just like I did at the beginning of the painting last week, I'm going in and looking for that important structure in the brow ridge, the bridge of the nose, trying to find all those different planes that describe those harder structures of the eye sockets, the bridge of the nose, the cheekbones. That's where most of the likeness lives, is in those bony landmarks of the skull. So I want to check in with all of those landmarks, make sure they're in the right spot before I go any further with light or dark, warm or cool, any of that more nuanced stuff happening on the surface of the portrait. We got to go from the inside out, and that all comes down to the drawing. I'm just using some quinachrome magenta. You can really use any color you like, just choose something that stands out and just go in and rebuild your entire drawing. So I'm blocking in a little bit of a shadow shape here. But I'm just going around making sure that everything's in the right place. I'm double and triple checking. The whole first pass is really just a first attempt. It's like a rough draft. Portraits are difficult, especially self-portraits can be really challenging. So I don't totally trust that first pass to be totally accurate. And I'm just using that one color to go in and redefine the drawing and just scrub in some of those basic shadow shapes. It's just like I'm restarting the portrait on top of itself. And then I'll go in and mix up a shadow shape here. So this whole process is really similar to the first pass on the painting. I don't want to totally erase or destroy what I had, but I'm not afraid to cover it up with new paint. Keep in mind this video is sped up quite a bit. I spent a little bit more time on this portrait than I have on the previous projects that we've done. So if it looks like I'm painting really, really fast, don't worry, this video is really sped up. I'm really taking my time mixing these colors and thinking about this drawing. So a lot of what I'm doing here is rebuilding what I already had. I'm checking in, double and triple checking that everything is in the right spot. Even if I'm repainting an area in the exact same way that it was painted before, then I can just be sure that that area is understood. Remember, it's not necessarily about adding new information or about getting detailed. If you want to paint realistically, that doesn't always mean painting all of the details. It's more about understanding the whole system that's creating your painting and how you see it. Make sure you have that background color, whatever it is in the background. Use the background to carve out the shape of the foreground. Another way to say that is to use the negative space to define the positive space. Have that background color ready all the time. It'll help you think about composition, and it's going to help you redefine the shape of the skull. So I'm going from general to specific. I'm thinking about the bigger shapes, slowly breaking them up into smaller shapes. I left off the last painting as a basic block in. So before I take that any further, I just want to re-establish what I had and then build that on top of that. But I can't stress enough that the likeness in a portrait is in the drawing. And what I mean by drawing, I know I said this last time, but what I mean by drawing is putting everything in the right place. So if you need more time on that, put that time in. Got a little bit of reflected light here. The light source hitting my face is also hitting the wall behind my head, and that white wall is reflecting light back into the shadow side of my head. So that's where that reflected light is coming from. So be aware of your light source. Think about how it's affecting not just the head that you're looking at, but the air around it, the space around it. If there's any bright walls, or maybe there might be a window affecting the light in the room. If you see any light or shadow, try and understand why it's doing what it's doing, and then you can understand it on your palette a little bit better, and then you'll understand it on your painting a little bit better. Something I struggle with in this painting is the color of the hair. It's a tricky thing that I often underestimate, but the color of the hair on my head, the facial hair on my face, the eyebrows, they're all slightly different colors, doing different things, getting hit by different light. Don't underestimate those areas, and if anything like that's giving you trouble, put the time in to figure it out. We want to paint those fun details of the light hitting a cheekbone or an eyelid, but it can be difficult to take something like hair or an ear or a part of the neck that we don't really look at too closely. It's hard to express those things simply in just a few brushstrokes without overcomplicating it. It's hard to do that and really understand it in a simple way. Sometimes that takes a lot more work than some of those areas that have the fun details. So allow yourself that time. And then inversely, sometimes what seems like the most difficult part of a painting can happen really quickly and effortlessly. You never really know what's going to happen. It's part of the fun, though. I guess what's also tricky about painting hair is we tend to think of our hair as being a certain color, but it tends to have lots of different colors. Try to think of it as a basic 3D form, just like you would paint anything else. Don't worry about the individual strands of hair. Don't try to paint them all at once. Think about the edges. Think about if the form of the hair is casting a shadow on the head. But try and express it in the most basic forms that you can, and then you can make it more complicated from there. For the hair on my head, some areas are lighter than others. Some of the facial hair gets more blonde or red or even gray in some areas, and it's a lot to deal with. The gray hairs in the beard are new for me, so maybe I'm a little afraid of them. One important thing to note here is that I keep moving around my painting. I'm kind of staying in orbit around the whole thing without getting too locked into any one area. If you find that you've been staring at the same piece of an eyelid for the last 90 minutes, I recommend standing up, walking away from your painting, do a lap around your house, maybe even clean off your palette, and then come back to the painting with fresh eyes. When we get sucked into an area, we might make that small area more accurate to what we're seeing, but generally the overall pattern of the whole painting, the unit as a whole, that tends to suffer. It's hard to see the big picture and focus on details at the same time. I think it's kind of impossible, really. We switch back and forth. We zoom in and look closely at these different pieces, but we have to remember to step back and see the whole thing. Seeing the forest from the trees, or seeing the stars that make up the constellation, whatever metaphor is helpful for you. Think about identifying all these pieces, but also recognizing the whole that they're all a part of. You have to learn to do both. If you only do one of those two things, you're not going to have a strong portrait. So make a habit out of standing up, stepping back from your painting. I've said this before, but I try to hold my paintbrush at the end of the brush handle because it keeps me a full arm's length away from my painting, which helps me see the big picture more often throughout the process. If you're holding the brush really close to the tip and your face is really close to the surface of your painting because you're trying to zoom in a lot all the time, you're going to end up with a lot of really beautiful details that don't add up together to form one whole big picture. So if that's something that you run into a lot, you have to try to change your behavior, try to make a habit out of stepping back. It's not easy. The thing that's more important than really nailing those details is trying to nail how they all fit together. It's harder to learn, it's harder to maintain, but over time, it's a really, really powerful skill to have. Not saying I even have it, but it's something I strive for. It's understanding how all the pieces fit together. And it could be in a gesture drawing, it could be a landscape painting, it could be a big studio painting that you work on for a long time, whatever it is. Try and find that balance of the individual pieces, but also how they all fit together. I think of them as two different ways of thinking, and I kind of switch back and forth. A lot of those marks I just made at the bottom of the eye socket just really didn't work out. And I covered them up and kind of repainted that whole area. So again, allow yourself the time and space to make mistakes and rebuild things. Especially rebuilding things that you might think went pretty well. Don't be afraid to destroy stuff. Because I want you to have the confidence to know how to rebuild something. Because then if you can know how to rebuild something that you created and you're not afraid to destroy things, you'll have the luxury of making really fearless paintings. So that whole light side of my head is getting a little bit pasty. So I should look a little bit more closely at the lighter midtones and the color coming through. as the light goes from the highlight on the forehead turning towards the darkness there. I'm trying to push that saturation. So we want to avoid that kind of painting where most of the light shape is pretty close to white paint and most of the dark shape is pretty close to black paint. A thing I've been saying throughout the whole class, and I say it in a lot of my painting classes, is that most of what we're seeing is in the midtones. All that color is happening in the midtones. It's between light and dark. It's where that light shape and that dark shape meet each other and collide. That's where the action's happening. That's where the conversation's going on between light and dark. And it's a lot more difficult to paint than black and white. Remember, as soon as your palette starts to run away from you, clean off the whole thing. Get comfortable with throwing away some paint if you're not sure why you mixed it or you don't remember because it was so long ago. Get that paint off of your palette and remix everything. The more often you do that, the better you're going to understand your colors. So I'm diving a little bit deeper into the details. But again, it's never a full-on switch to, okay, now I'm ready for details. I kind of dip my toes in and then I back up and reestablish stuff. And I'm kind of swapping out these interchangeable pieces of these brushstrokes and seeing what works and what doesn't. It's not a race to the finish line with how much detail I can shove into this painting. I'm trying to distill everything I'm seeing into the least amount of brushstrokes possible. I'm trying to be as efficient and economical with my brushstrokes as I can. Not because I'm trying to be cheap with my paint, but I think something about that trying to distill what I'm seeing, trying to compress all that information into the shortest amount of strokes possible. There's a lot of beauty and poetry in that kind of painting and that kind of seeing. It's just the kind of paint that I'm into, I guess. Definitely inspired by people like Sargent and everyone that came after him who was chasing that too. So if your skin color is anything similar to mine and you're as sunburned as I am, it's a lot of alizarin crimson and cad yellow on my nose. I put my zinc sunscreen on every day. It's still just, my nose is just red all summer. try to keep my hat on all day when I'm lifeguarding, and still the light finds its way onto my face. I guess there's just so much light at the beach, reflecting off the sand and the water. So whether I'm painting a self-portrait or dealing with my sunburn, I'm very concerned with the amount of light hitting my face. I've moved the ear around a handful of times throughout the whole painting. Remember, don't be afraid to shift something over if it feels like it's in the wrong spot and affecting your painting. It's never too late to do something like that. The ear tends to be something that slides around the head sometimes for me. It's a little bit easier to move than an eyeball, but whatever it is, if something has to move, don't wait to change it. Don't save it for later. You're just going to create more work for yourself. Anytime you walk away from a painting and walk back up to it and notice something that has to change, make that change right then and there. So here I'm still dealing with that transition from the forehead into the hairline. And the hair itself is casting a shadow onto the forehead. Something I missed the first few times around. We tend to think of hair as a two-dimensional thing, like the color of our skin. It's really like a 3D form. So in this case, the hair itself is casting a shadow onto my forehead. Think about hair as having form and shape, just like any other 3D object. So again, don't worry too much about adding information, adding new details. Think about how you can take what you have and finesse it into a more accurate or realistic depiction of what you're seeing, but keeping it as simple as you can. That's harder to do than just copying what you're seeing. You're kind of forced to translate what you're seeing into larger and more bold brushstrokes, but it's a really healthy exercise for your painting practice to do that, because you'll start to see things in brushstrokes. Instead of choppy little marks like the pixels in our cameras. I think brushstrokes are a more organic extension of being human, and that's what makes painting so relevant. I think now more than ever.